Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last, but certainly not least, all of you with confirmation bias. You will find what you're looking for. You're listening to Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix, a family-friendly podcast where we logically speculate on life. The only trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation, so if applying the Socratic method on fringe topics is disturbing to you, turn off the podcast now. I want to clarify again for this series that we are not trying to prove or disprove Genesis 1 to 11. Right now, I am focused solely on trying to identify what Genesis is claiming and what it is not claiming in the original text. From there, we will address the efficacy of Scripture itself and whether this text has been turned into legend or whether it is a detailed and real account of actual events. This series is meant to flow as a logical argument, if you will, to analyze the text, and as such, I am going to work through and address one point at a time. For tonight's episode, it's just going to be me with a guest because our co-host Trace double booked himself and he had a trip that he forgot to tell me about, even though we had pre-booked a guest for tonight. So it'll just be me and the guest coming up here in a couple minutes. So I did get permission from Trace to kind of tease him a little bit and everything for that. So it's all in good fun here, of course. I also do want to give a reminder to our listeners to give us a like if you're listening on YouTube, subscribe if you're on YouTube, definitely rate the podcast if you're listening on Spotify or any other streaming forums like that. And since Trace is not with us, there will sadly be no fish talk or creature talk for this episode. Our guest for this episode is a friend of mine, Karl, and he's a pastor, and he has a different interpretation than the conclusion that we reached studying Genesis 1 in the last episode. So I figured having him on to explain his perspective, why he believes what he believes, and how he interprets the text would be a good counter, if you will, to the viewpoint that I've laid out thus far. And then you as a listener can judge for yourself from our interlinear study and from a pastor's analysis what you think is correct. So without further ado, we are going to transition into talking with our guest right about now. So we got Karl Stennett here from Christian Life Church. He's a youth pastor over there. So how's it going, Karl?
Good morning, Chef. It's well with my soul. How about yours?
Doing good, man. Doing good. Oh, I love it. So you are a proponent of the gap theory then, yes?
Oh, boy. I think I explained this a little bit earlier as well, but I think gap theory has some validity. I like some of what it proposes. I'm not saying I would not call myself a gap theorist. I don't hold firmly to any particular belief concerning creationism, with a few exceptions. But I can't call myself a steadfast gap theorist, but there are some big things in gap theory that I definitely agree with.
All right.
Or I think hold validity.
All right. Well, fair enough. I did not do much prep because I wanted to have a fair platform here and everything. So if you could tell us a little bit about the gap theory and kind of what your beliefs and standpoint is on it all.
Yeah, I'll read to you from the National Center for Science Education. I'll give you a very brief description on what they call gap theory, and then hopefully I can explain where I differ and what I think has some validity in it. And so the gap theory is known as, also called ruin restitution theory, preserves the literal, recent 6 24-hour day creation, but assumes the vast ages so well attested to by science occurred prior to this set of events. In other words, Earth and life was created before the creation week of Genesis, which is super interesting. So that's gap theory according to National Center for Science Education. Most people, when they talk about gap theory, at least in my denomination, AG, they think that gap theory is that there is a greater time span between the days, where the days have greater values than 24 hours. So is that tracking with you? Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. So basically the theory is saying that the original creation was actually before, and that the creation account we see in Genesis 1 is a secondary creation of sorts. Is that kind of what it's saying?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so where do you differ on that then? Is that exactly kind of your standpoint, or do you have an
Mhm.
offshoot?
Well, this is where I kind of blend with some other beliefs, like progressive creationism. We have, depending on where you stand with the whole idea of carbon dating, because I know there's a ton of issues with carbon dating and how accurate that can be.
Right.
You, there is no doubt that we have these creatures or otherwise plants, etc., that have existed for forever before humans ever were in the picture. And even if you think that um, carbon dating is off, it can't be off by that much. Um, and so I would say, where I agree with this is I think that there's definitely some creation to account for, and a timeline to account for before the creation story of man. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that I understand your viewpoint. I would definitely disagree with it, but I understand it for sure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what would you say then would have been created before the creation account we see? Just as a recap for you, because I know you just got back from a trip, you didn't have time to check out the episode we just did. But our analysis of the text indicated that there was actually something present before creation, but that it was water, and that was the only thing present before creation besides like God Himself. And that was our reading and our interpretation of what the original text from Hebrew was saying.
Well, without making you go too much back into that previous episode, um, expound on that for me just a little bit.
No, yeah, absolutely. This is a conversation, so we can definitely build off of things that we've talked about before. But yeah, so in Genesis, I'm looking at Genesis 1 here, looking at verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And as we follow this creation account down, we see that God forms and molds these waters, if you will, into the ocean and debatably the canopy or the clouds, depending on your interpretation of water in the sky in Genesis 1 here. And that word for waters is indeed the word for water. Let me find it here real quick in my interlinear analysis. Yeah, so Hamayim is what we're talking about here, which literally translates to the waters. And so this is indeed the original intent of the Hebrew text, I believe, is to say that there was water before creation. But then I guess my point of contention then comes with when we see God creating and calling everything else into existence. Because we see him going into detail to create everything else in the Genesis 1 account aside from water. So how would you reconcile there being something before, and what would you say was before, looking at this text and trying to synergize that with modern science?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love this question. Now I'm getting more excited. Yeah, let me give you just a couple thoughts on this. So the first thing that I'll say is, yeah, every book that you read in the scriptures, you have to consider the genre that it is, and that tells you how to interpret the passage that you're reading or the chapter, et cetera, et cetera. And before there were, with the Pentateuch the Torah. It's a chunk of stories, and each one kind of has their own genre, and so you can't look at like Genesis isn't just a historical book. Genesis isn't just uh, poetic. I'm trying to think of the other genres presented in scriptures, but you get the gist. Those kinds of things determine how you read the story. And I'll tell you that since becoming a parent, it has changed my view of scriptures just tremendously. I having to like a big type of conversation that I'm thinking about constantly is how do I teach my daughter about God? How do I bring this concept that is so far above our understanding, out of sight? You can't wrap your mind around this idea that something existed before you, something because she can't comprehend that I existed before her. So how can she comprehend that something is eternal? It had no beginning, it had no end, and so when I read Genesis now, I was just like you. I want to look at the words. I want to look at um, the linguistics of it. Um, how is it written? What genre is it written? And I want to say that this is what that passage means. But since becoming a dad, um, it's wrestling with these questions. It's made me appreciate what Moses, who we take for granted as the author of the Pentateuch, the Torah, what Moses is trying to accomplish for the people of Israel. So he's trying to take this massive concept that is far greater than any person can comprehend, and make it into something tangible, something relatable, not just for the people in his immediate vicinity, but every generation that would read that after that, because he was the one that was commanding them, read the laws to each other, read the laws to your children, let your children read the laws to their children. So he knew that it would go down from generation to generation. And so when he's transcribing this, and the Holy Spirit is putting the words in his heart, I imagine that he's asking himself, and he's thinking, he's wondering, how do I communicate this thought about God's character, his nature, to the generations to come, who will be separated by cultures, who will be separated by worlds, who will be separated by years. And so I tend not to look at the passage so literally and say, well, this is this many days, this is what done. The questions that I'm asking myself are, what does this say about the nature and the character of God? Because that the Bible and all of its entirety, that's what that book is about. It's about God, his goodness, and then his relationship to mankind, in that order. And so I love the question that you're asking. When I read the passage, it says in the very first chapter, it says, in the beginning God created what?
The heavens and the earth.
Yeah. So when I interpret that, the way that I process it is the heavenly realms and the earth. So the earth is a part of the heavenly realm that has a place there in the heavenly realms. You get in I think it's in the Corinthians when Paul talks about being caught up into the third heaven. Who knows what that meant? We could debate that all the livelong day, but the way that I interpret that is that God created the heavenly things and the earthly things. I was having a conversation with my wife about aliens, of all things, not long ago. Somebody was making a joke because I'm a big proponent of them, not in a conspiracy theorist kind of way, but just in a listen, the universe is massive and God's no chump, so who knows? So yeah, when you read these passages, I was proposing that you could interpret it that God created the spiritual things, it's the heavenly realms, and the physical things, that's the earth. That's one interpretation. And so I would say, that before the literal 7 days, before the concept of earthly creation, God created the heavens first, and the heavens are teeming with life. From the word go, whether you are an evolution theory, Big Bang theory proponent, or a devout, literal 7-day creationist, you cannot deny that the heavens are teeming with energy, with life, and with movement. So I would say, there's life there. And if you wanted to go just that route with the science route, then you can say they're teeming with life in a microscopic level. If you want to go with the spiritual route, you can say, listen, the angels have been around long before men. If you're a Tolkien fan, you would agree with that. And they're going to be around long after our fleshly bodies decay. But the scriptures talk about things that have eternal worth. The angels are eternal. The human soul is eternal. So we know that the angels have existed before men. Does that answer any of your question?
I think a little bit, yeah. So you're seeing it more as this is kind of an allegory of Moses trying to talk to God's children in a sense and put it into terms that like a child would be able to understand. That's kind of more your angle.
I wouldn't call it. Yeah, I wouldn't call it an allegory, but I would absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, I would say that this is Moses is trying to convey something about the nature and the character of God. He's not trying to give them a history lesson. Yeah.
So, I love your alien comment. Definitely a huge proponent of the alien perspective and everything as well. We actually have a UFO episode lined up in the coming months that we're gonna dive into and talk a whole bunch about UFOs, and the M Quad theory actually delves into the idea of the spiritual and everything as well. There's a reason that we have the podcast name is Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix, and it's intentionally 4 M's because the shortcut for it is M to the 4th power. And it's a nod that the 4th dimension and beyond might actually be the spiritual realm. And that's why we see a lot of things behave bizarrely in the way that we see them behave. That's why we see a lot of really weird descriptions that don't make sense. That's in like talking in terms of like angels and everything like that. So on that front there, I think that we would...
You should have called me up for that one.
Oh man, that's the whole foundation of the of the podcast right there. That's like the bare bones crux. But yeah, that's our whole thought process and everything. We'll have to get you on again to talk a little bit about that more. Maybe when we get into like angels and demons and things like that, maybe we'll have you on again to kind of interject some thoughts and everything into that. But to circle back here to Genesis 1, I think that I understand where you're coming from, but then I think we're faced with a big problem if we want to say that this is maybe not an allegory, but if this is... I don't know the best way to word your perspective here, but if it's putting it in terms of, of a child being able to understand, then at what point do we delineate that we are able to clearly read Genesis as an actual historical narrative? Because I'm sure you would agree that there are certainly points in Genesis that are not up for debate at all, that they are, literal accounts. When you start getting into the accounts of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, I believe that's mostly in Genesis. Yes, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Still there?
Let me rephrase it or repeat it back to you, just to make sure that I heard you.
I lost you for a second there.
Can you hear me?
Yep, now I got you back.
There we go. Okay, awesome. Let me just make sure that I understood your question. You said, if that's the case, at what point do you differentiate between allegory that's not meant to be taken literally, and then historical parts that are meant to be taken factually?
Yes, absolutely.
That's a really good question.
That's exactly my question, and we talked about this in the last episode as well. But the character Vav is I believe it's a verb. I'm kind of spacing right now. A verb in the original Hebrew that it's used regularly and frequently to specify narrative whenever it's a narrative text. And it is used, I believe, 55 times was the count. Again, our listeners will know exactly what I'm saying here because I said it in the last episode. Now I'm second guessing myself. But it was used approximately 55 times within the whole creation narrative. And when you read this text as well, you look at the specificity of it in my mind, where it says that there was evening and there was morning the first day. Evening was the start of the Hebrew day, as I'm sure you know, that their Sabbaths would begin on, the sunset. And so it's specifying that the sun that the sun would go down and then come back up, or at least that marking of time would have occurred. Anytime we see any one of 3 things, and this is a recap from the last episode as well, anytime where we see one of 3 things used in all of the Old Testament in association with the word day in Hebrew, yom, it means a literal 24-hour day, whether it's in those 3 things are evening, morning, and a number. And any one of those 3 anywhere else in the entire Old Testament indicates like a 24-hour day span. And we have all 3 emphasized over and over again in Genesis 1. So I say all this is to kind of give you a little bit of background from the first episode and where I'm coming from and everything. So how do we take all of that, seeing Vav used so much to indicate that this is narrative? How do we take, the evening, morning, first day that we know is repetition to affirm from the original Hebrew that this is a 24-hour day? How do we take that then and delineate something that seems so clear from other narrative?
I think that the scriptures are self-referential, so you're right there. I think that I know that scripture has to support scripture. I'm thinking.
Still there?
Yeah, no, I'm processing your commentary there.
Well, I
Um,
asked a good question then, I guess.
you know, I had a great follow-up question and I lost it. While I chew on your question, let me bring this one up too. That's my dog. So, I can't account for the stories of Abraham, but from Moses going forward, I can give you those accounts. We know to take these as testimonial stories because they're Moses' stories, and he intends for them to be interpreted that way as, hey, this is a testimony of what the Lord has done. Man, what a phenomenal question. He takes off from Adam and Eve, goes to Cain and Abel. From Cain and Abel, he goes generationals down to, I'm thinking out loud now, so you have to give me a minute.
No, yeah, absolutely. Goes
Yeah,
into the
so from Cain and Abel, he
generational,
goes down.
flows into the flood
Yep.
after Cain and
Yeah.
Abel, and then it flows into more generational, Tower of Babel, and then from there, I
Yeah.
think it flows into Abraham.
Yeah.
And then the
So
city
I
of
don't
Ur,
know,
which
man.
we
I
did
would, I would,
actually uncover, I believe, that is an actual known historical location, the city of Ur, where Abraham originally starts off in.
yeah. I mean, so again, some of those historical facts are there for, they should be. Otherwise, you throw out more than you need to. Um, I would, as somebody that reads a lot, I would start to piece apart that book like it were a story, and I'd look at each one of those generational gaps as a transition in how I should interpret this particular story. You have heaven and earth. From heaven and earth, you get Adam and Eve, which is the creation of man. From the creation of man, you go down to creation of God's chosen people. And each one of these kinds of tells a different story about the history of mankind. You go from the fall, then you go from God's redemption. The redemption arc enters in with Abraham. Actually, I wouldn't even say that. I would say it happens with Adam and Eve, but you start to get some momentum with the redemption story arc in scriptures with Abraham when he calls somebody out to become his chosen person. And so that's kind of, again, I'm not saying don't take it literally, but that's how I would look at those passages, and that's how I'd want to start interpreting them in a particular light, different than another one. There's so many arguments concerning the Adam and Eve one, and I don't really have a side. So many arguments with Cain and Abel, but then when you start getting with Abraham, the what is there to argue about? This is a person's testimony concerning the nature of God. You're going to argue with what this person experienced. So, at that point, I would start probably interpreting more literally than figuratively. And again, that's not to say that Babel never happened. That's not to say that Cain never slew Abel in a field, or that Adam and Eve produced a tremendous number of babies from just the two of them. But that's kind of how I would piece that apart. And I understand that that word is used to to signify a 24-hour period. But you're talking about trying to convey a massive topic to somebody that doesn't comprehend much more than their own existence. And so I do this with Amelia all the time. I just try to explain something to her, and I know she's not going to understand it. So what I do is I give it the simplest explanation. And I know if I were to tell an adult that, they would just look at me cross-eyed. But Millie starts to get it. And then, in a year or two, when we revisit that topic, I'll give her some more explanation to that. She'll be able to understand it in new life because her experience has grown. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I would say my follow-up question to that then would be, if this is meant to be a simple, digestible account, we have light created on day one, and light is separated from the darkness. We have an evening and a morning the first day, and then on day 4 is when we actually have the luminary bodies, so the sun, the moon, and all the stars created. And so my follow-up then would be, if this is meant to be an easy, digestible story to understand the gist of the creation account, why would there be such a confusing detail if this is meant to be be digestible like milk is, like if it's meant to be something that's easy to process? Because that doesn't sound easy to process to me. Looking at this, I know in in my earlier years, I saw this and I was like, no, that can't be right. This has to be, misinterpretation, misunderstanding or something. But, again, we broke this down in our interlinear study last episode. Light indeed is created on day one, and it's separated from the dark. And then you have an evening and morning, and then you have the luminaries, the actual bodies that emit this light, created on day 4. So it seems to choose a certain way to tell the narrative of the creation account, but it doesn't seem like it's simple to me. Does that make sense?
So the passage what you're saying is that the bodies of light came separate and after the actual light. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that's what we see in Genesis.
Yeah. What does John 1 teach us?
What does John 1 teach us? Do tell.
Yeah, it says that Jesus is the light.
Are you talking about First John, or are you talking about the Gospel of John?
Gospel John. John. Yeah. John makes lots of commentaries concerning Christ and his radiant glory. It's interesting that mankind was made to reflect the Lord. And I would, if you want to get into the sci-fi stuff, we can get into the sci-fi stuff. I could foresee a world where there's no sun necessary. There's nothing needed to reflect the glory of God, and that we can just be in God's glory without the, I don't know how else to say this, without the damnation that comes from that, from guilty sin. Does that? I'm really throwing some stuff out there that unless you've been in my house at 5 o'clock in the morning for coffee for years in a row, people might be missing out on.
Yeah, no. For those for our listeners that don't have background, Karl and I have definitely we've done that for several years on and off. Been able to meet in the morning sometimes and have some pretty deep discussions on life and all sorts of different topics. So that's definitely what he's alluding there too. But yeah, I'm tracking with that. I think you outlined that in a straightforward enough way for our listeners to pick up on.
Yeah, I think that. And I think you're trying to create something that let's be honest. Like, science does not disprove the Lord. Like, that's such a stupid thing to believe. And nor does science prove the Lord. Science is a method of study, and with every study, we study the Lord. It's in one way or the other. We have to study the Lord. And people who are extremely well-intending Christians in their spiritual lives don't study the Lord well. So why would it be any different with our science? And so the reason that I'm saying that is because, I have some beliefs concerning how the spiritual and the physical interact with each other. These two pieces that God created at the very beginning. God created the heavens and the earth, the spiritual and the physical, and how they interact with each other. They're incredibly intertwined. There's a psychology book called The Body Keeps the Score. And when you're emotionally and spiritually dealing with stuff, your body shows the effects of that. Mm-hmm. And so the real world's no different. Is when something's going on in the spiritual, the physical acts. And it's the reason why, like, you go to a Pentecostal church and the Holy Spirit is moving and people do weird crap. Yeah, I wish they wouldn't, but when spirit meets flesh, it does weird things. And so when God radiates his glory, it shines. And whatever that looks like, however we want to interpret that, that's the radiant glory of the Lord. And so it would make sense to me that he would create the bodies to reflect that after the light shined, after he separated. And it's important to say that he separated and not segregated, that they served purposes. They weren't, at this point in time too in history, it's not evil and good, bad or good. That both of these things were parts of him, parts of his character, parts of his nature. And so again, we started talking about this earlier. I mentioned to you that this account is meant to talk about the character and nature of God. So what does this say about us? It says that God has a refreshing side that shines light on everything, and a cool and restful side. I don't know, take it however you want, but that's kind of the way that I process that.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. I want to circle back here to something you said a little bit earlier, because I know you said you were wanting to try to keep this under right around that 30-minute mark, and we were getting close to time. You had said that you believe that there was, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but you had alluded to the idea that you believe that there was something before creation. What exactly would you think that was?
Just to make sure that I understand your question appropriately, when you say creation, we're talking about earthly creation, correct?
Yeah, the Genesis 1 creation. Sorry, that's my bad. I should have been a little more specific there. So
Yeah.
my understanding from what you said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
is that there was something before the Genesis 1 creation we see. So what would you believe that is? Is that just the earth and everything in it, more or less, to kind of justify the carbon-14 dating and all the fossil layers and everything else that we see? Or is there another reasoning for it? Like what's your thought process there?
I would say that Earth is part of the creation theory in Genesis 1, so I wouldn't make that statement. Um, you know, I would say the heavenly hosts. I know Genesis 1 specifically says the heavens. Um, you
So
know what? Actually, I'm not sure if I would say that. Let me process that. Um, you have you have probably some study information in front of you. What does the word beginning mean in Hebrew, or what is the word for beginning in Hebrew?
that is a fantastic question that I did not look at or discuss when we were doing the first episode. Saying you caught me slacking a little bit here. So this word for in the beginning,
Because
and
you know
its
what?
same conjugation is used like in Jeremiah to talk about in the beginning of the reign, talking about a king beginning his reign. Let's take a look at the broader
Yeah,
term here.
this is insane. Yeah,
Looking at other uses here. Yeah, like it's used. This word, a conjugation of this word, is used to describe the first fruits that would be brought as sacrifices in Exodus several times, in Leviticus. So there is a definite clear beginning to this word. The root
yeah,
word is reshith here. It
yeah.
means beginning or chief. Beginning is the most common translation. We have choice, choicest, finest, first fruits, foremost. So pretty clear beginning
Here's
definition there,
how.
but I think you have another thought to share with us.
Yeah, yeah. Here's how I interpret that, and I'll have to end it on this. And I'm so sorry because you know me, I'd sit and talk with you about this for hours.
No, you're good, man.
Um,
I understand.
this is this is my um, we know for certain that God's ways are higher than ours. His wisdom is greater than ours. There are things that my daughter, in her 5-year-old state, cannot comprehend um, from the perspective of 30-year-old. She won't. You know, she never will. He says in the beginning. What beginning? Who's qualifying the beginning? We're qualifying the beginning. This is a mankind's account, um, and its purpose is for ours. Um, why would the Lord be trying to speak to us concerning things that are greater than us or far beyond our ability to comprehend? Does that make sense?
I think I see where you're coming from, but that is where I would disagree, is where I think that there is a very clear emphasis put on, there was evening and there was morning the first day. And I touched on this one on the last episode as well, but I think it's interesting here that there's an evening and there's a morning, but there's no sun to mark that we are told that there's an evening and a morning. And so this would be, if you wanted to say anything was a metaphor, this would be where I would say a little bit more of a metaphor is being used, because this is their way of saying, hey, a 24-hour time period elapsed. We're actually seeing in verse 3 here, when God says, let there be light, and it flows into verse 5 when it talks about evening and morning the first day. It's my theory and my reading of this text from the Hebrew that this is actually the point that time is created. And we know that God has to be outside of time when we reference that verse in 2 Peter that says, a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. I think that is telling us that God is outside of time, which is mandated for an infinite mover to kickstart the universe, because you can't have a being within the universe create the universe. You have to have an infinite mover outside for any of this to work. That's the only way for God to really be God.
Dimensions. Yeah. So you're opening up this conversation a little more. Listen, from the bottom of my heart, I'm sorry that I have to leave this conversation. But call me back when you get into the aliens thing, and then we'll talk about creation from that perspective.
No, absolutely, man. Yeah. Hey, well, maybe we'll try to have you on again at some point here to kind of have a little bit more of a discussion on this, and get my co-host on as well, because he couldn't join us. He had a trip he was on. But yeah, no, we'll try to have this conversation again, and if not, then we'll definitely have you on again for something else, talking about more interdimensional aliens and demons. But yeah, thanks for coming on, Karl. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts here with us. Much. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was Karl Stennett from Christian Life Church, youth pastor over there, sharing his thoughts with us on Genesis 1, the gap theory, progressive creationism. And from here, we'll be wrapping up the show. So if you have any other thoughts that you want to add, or any questions, comments, concerns, concessions, confessions, anything in that category, you can email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You can find us on social media platforms. Instagram and TikTok handle is m.quad.musings. And you can find us on Facebook as well at Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. Just type that in and we'll pop right up. Well, hope you all enjoyed the show tonight. And join us next week, as we'll be diving into our interlinear study on Genesis 2 and 3, and we will have Trace back for that, so you won't have to just listen to me talk to myself here. Have a good night.